Hey TechKnowStuds, in this video we're going to cover Bitcoin. It was the first cryptocurrency and still the most well-known cryptocurrency. So we're going to jump into that. It's a good place to start. And then we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms that it has and how it operates, what Bitcoin mining is, and then we'll talk about some of the problems with Bitcoin as well. Although I've already covered what blockchain is, I want to do a quick review because it's pretty instrumental into what we're going to talk about with Bitcoin. So remember that a blockchain is a series of blocks. A block has a set of data to include a nonce value, and then it creates a hash which shows up in the next block and also gets calculated into the next hash, which shows up into the next block and gets calculated into the next hash. And then we also have that proof of work. And the proof of work allows us to slow this process down so that way no one can just quickly go and change a bunch of blocks. That proof of work is changing the nonce value until you meet some sort of criteria and successfully meet that criteria. In this example right here, we're looking for 4 zeros, and the computers are going to, or the devices that are calculating this, are going to keep trying different nonce values until it gets 4 zeros here. So that is blockchain. And one thing that blockchain allows us to do is have distributed blockchain. So rather than have central control over something, that there is a server that is controlling everything or a main source of truth, we're able to distribute that source of truth. And so every single machine out here can have all of the blocks with it, and all of them could be competing to find what the next block is. And that's going to be pretty critical when we come to talking about Bitcoin mining. Blockchain can handle a lot of different types of data. All it needs to do is you input the data into those blocks, and then it can be part of the blockchain. But one of the most common are different transactions. So different transactions can be written in here. An example of that might be with Bitcoin is how many coins are being transferred from one person to another, and then maybe some details about that. And so that is a transaction. Well, those transactions make up the ledger. The ledger is a term that's been used for a long time. It just means that you're keeping track of an account, the additions and subtractions out of the account, or the transfers within the account. So that's the ledger. So within blockchain and within Bitcoin, the ledger is all of those transactions, and those are all public. So you can actually see for the lifespan of Bitcoin, all of the transactions that have happened. Now let's talk about Bitcoin mining. The first thing to understand is you could actually participate in Bitcoin mining. It's probably advisable to have a certain power, certain level of computer, something that has what's called GPU, a lot of GPU to it. But you'll have a machine that is capable of processing a lot of transactions very quickly. So if you have that machine, then you would download software onto that machine that would help it participate in this Bitcoin mining. The first thing that it would do is it would download all the past blocks, all the past ledger. So it has the full ledger involved in it. So it downloads all of that, and then it starts listening for a transaction. And a transaction will come in, and that transaction has certain information in it. And that transaction will probably be transferring a certain number of Bitcoins or fraction of a Bitcoin from one account to another. And so it has certain details with that transaction. Well, each of these machines will first of all create a new block so it could store that next transaction in there. And within that data, it's going to log that transaction. So it's within the data section, it logs that transaction. Then they start listening for the next transaction, and we'll log that as well. And the next one, and so on and so forth, until the data part of this block fills up. For Bitcoin, that's approximately 2,400 transactions. So once it reaches that limit on how much data it can handle, then there's going to be one more transaction that it's going to put in there, and each of these machines is going to put in a different transaction. So this that transaction for this machine, it's going to record a account number that you've entered into it, your account number, and a certain number of Bitcoins. Right now, that number of Bitcoins is 6.25. It does change over time. It halves about every 4 years. So it's going to slowly decrease over time. So it records this, your account, because you are going to get a reward. This is your benefit for participating in Bitcoin mining. It's going to be how you earn money from Bitcoin mining. And each one of these machines puts their own accounts in there with that 6.25 Bitcoins. And this one, same thing, their account with a number of Bitcoins, and this one, same thing, its account with the number of Bitcoins. So only one of these devices is going to get the reward. All right, so once that happens, now you are participating, you've figured out the block, you figured out all the transactions, you've entered in your own transaction. At this point in time, you need to start calculating for those numbers of zeros. And we gave an example of changing the nonce value. So that's how we're going to get the 4 zeros involved here. That's the criteria we're looking for. Well, Bitcoin is actually looking for 17 zeros. So that's, and we'll talk a little more about how that's defined here in a second, but it is looking for 17 zeros. So you're constantly trying different nonce combinations till you find 17 zeros. And once you have, then you win that block. If you're the first one to find that next block, that next correct value there. So once you do that, let's say you've found the correct one, you will send out that block to all other devices, and all other devices will then check it. That's the proof part. You've done the work, your machine has done the work. Now other devices need to do the proof. And all they have to do is take a look at all the transactions you have, look at your nonce, put it into the hash to figure out if your hash is correct and if there's 17 zeros. And if it's correct, then you've won. You win the reward. And so now all other devices is going to take your block and add it as the next block, and then they'll start working on the next block after that, and they're going to hope that they're going to win the next block. So you get the reward, and that reward is going to be, once again, 6.25, which does change over time. And all other machines is going to have that transaction, understanding that you've won that reward now. So a couple interesting things that Bitcoin, by definition, has implemented in here. Your data size can change. It doesn't need to be something that's static, but for Bitcoin, it has a data size that can handle approximately 2,400 transactions. So that's one interesting thing about Bitcoin. And another thing to note is that it will handle about 144 blocks per day. So that just gives you kind of an example of the scale of what we're talking about here. 2,400 times 144 blocks per day would give you approximately how many transactions happens per day, which is actually, to me, a little surprisingly low with that number. Another thing to keep in mind too is that proof of work, what they define for proof of work is they want the computers to struggle a little bit with figuring out what the next block is. And so they're going to, for Bitcoin, it says, we want that struggle to take about 10 minutes for a machine to be able to win, for it to prove that it did the work. And so the number of zeros that it needs in the hash it needs to be such that the average time it takes to figure out the next block is going to be about 10 minutes, which means that the number of zeros that it's looking for changes over time. So right now it's looking for 17 zeros. So it's looking for 17 zeros in that hash to figure out who won and who gets the reward. As computers get faster and faster and this time goes down, let's say it slips down to now it's taking 8 minutes, then it's going to go and recalibrate and say, okay, now we're looking for 8 zeros. And so that way it brings it back up to 10 minutes. Another interesting thing around Bitcoin is that we've already said that for a currency to be valid, it needs to have some sort of limits to it. Well, Bitcoin does, and this is one thing that might make Bitcoin continue to rise up in value and still create demand out there, is that it's limited to 21 million Bitcoin. And right now, we're around 19.5 million Bitcoin. So because of this, that we can see that there is a limited number of Bitcoins out there. And you may ask, well, how do we create more Bitcoin? I mean, we're obviously 1.5 million shy of reaching our top here. What does that look like? Well, first of all, what that looks like is how you get more Bitcoin out there is when you win that block, you get another 6.25 Bitcoins. And so we're giving out 6.25 times approximately 144 a day. So what is that? Probably around maybe 900 Bitcoin per day that's getting handed out. And then that's going to half every so often. It's going to be cut in half every once in a while. So as we can see with this is it's going to take a while to get to that 21 million Bitcoin limit. Another thing that will be interesting is when we run out of Bitcoin to hand out, what will probably happen is there's probably going to be some sort of transaction fee that's going to be introduced where everybody part of this transaction, part of this block, whoever did that transaction is going to have to pay a little bit to the Bitcoin miner, so that way they still can get paid for the services that they're rendering with this. So there's a few interesting parameters with Bitcoin. Now, cryptocurrency does have some problems with it. Some of it's technology problems that new updates are coming out to fix. Some of them are inherent with certain coins that are out there, and so new coins are created to overcome those problems. And other are problems with the technology itself, with just the idea of decentralization. So let's get into what some of those problems are. So one of those things that we're going to cover, I'm going to do a video on what forks are and hard forks are, because what can happen is that two devices on Bitcoin that are Bitcoin mining can come up with the solution at the same time. So what happens in those cases? So another thing that can happen is that there is environmental problems that this can cause. There's a lot of processing that happens. When you're talking about a bank who has these big infrastructures, sure, it uses up a lot of electricity. But when you're talking about anybody can jump on there and use all of this electricity to do Bitcoin mining, it can become a big problem with our environment. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Then we'll also talk about competition that's come in and how much competition, why competition has come in. So I'll do a video on altcoins. And then finally, we're going to talk about other inherent problems within the technology for you to watch out for and be aware of.